Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're watching last week, you will have seen me embark on a very ambitious 4-level layout design, getting phase 1 completed. For this week's video, I will add in all the details and finish that design. So at this point, most of the track locations have been settled. There's still some more adjustments to make, but it's time to start going back over the whole railroad again and fill in some details. Here we go back to level 1 in the main room, the Clinchfield Scenic Run and the south staging. And when I filled in the yard ladders at both ends, no matter how I tried it, we ended up running out of length. Several of these tracks are only around 7 feet long, and we set ourselves a 10-foot minimum. So clearly this wasn't going to work. But I'd already come up with a plan B for that. We can extend the yard into this area, and instead of having the reversing loop in this corner, move it around and put it in the east alcove. Another thing you may notice in this particular iteration is the colors of the track. This is a neat feature of Third Planet, which I always use while I'm drawing. Straight track is in black, circular curves are red, and easements are in green. You can see here that all my significant curves have proper easements on them. I generally use about a 16-inch easement in HO scale. Where it's shorter is because I have a much larger radius curve. Sometimes it's necessary to put in a section of larger radius curve at the end, just to be able to reach the tangent at all. Here I've started blocking in the Clinchfield Scenic Run. Coming out of the south end of Pool Point Tunnel, we have the bridge. Although it turns out that the tunnel is a lot closer to the bridge, that's something that I had to change. There's another tunnel before reaching Laurel. I don't know what it's called on the prototype, but it is near the town of Clinchfield, so I just called it Clinchfield Tunnel. And at Laurel, I have copied the track arrangement currently shown on Google Maps, where there are 2 passing sidings, one much longer than the other. I've no idea what the track arrangement may have looked like in the 50s, but we don't particularly want to be operating down here anyway. There will already be plenty of operators in this yard most of the time. This is just purely a scenic run down at knee level. South of Laurel, the track crosses 2 trestles in quick succession with a short tunnel between them, so I've copied that here. Although on the prototype, the second trestle is straight and the stream does not cross back under a second time. Only the north trestle crosses the stream. I've used modeler's license because it works better this way, allowing us to return the stream to the foreground. I've also indicated how we can include a continuous circuit on this lower level, allowing him to get some minimal operation before having to build too much railroad. Although in this iteration the turnout is clearly in the wrong place. The grades don't work with it out there. It has to be well back over the other side of the helix. Here is this level again with the problems fixed. We can see that the staging yard has now been extended. All the tracks are better than 10 feet long. And since we don't need to keep the back track open as a run-through for turning trains, we now have 10 staging tracks instead of 9. And the reversing loop is now in the alcove where I showed you earlier. I've also moved this turnout where it has a full loop to be able to drop down under itself, allowing us to keep the grades down to less than 2%. And note how all 3 of the hidden turnouts are in locations where they can easily be accessible under a chunk of removable scenery. And then something else I like to include in staging areas where possible is a few stub tracks for spare locomotive storage. They are, of course, entirely optional, but I've shown how they can be included. And there's something else I want to point out now that I've got the whole level 1 visible again. I mentioned earlier that we didn't want to be operating this low down in this room, whereas the lower deck has 2 switching areas in the other room. We did carefully consider that and decided that we can keep the elevation high enough to operate comfortably from a rollabout stool. And we decided that the Perry mine job will be assigned to the Shelby yard operator to be run during a slack time, and the Darton mine turn will be assigned to the same operator that does the lumber mill. And once again, he'll do that during a slack time. That way we don't introduce any additional operators other than the 2 that are already in this room. At this point, I went over the entire layout and worked out some tentative elevations. I'll show you the other decks as well. If you're interested, you can pause it and figure it out. In most cases, the level separation is in the region of 16 to 20 inches. Although these are not the final versions, I ended up revamping them again later. Now here is another iteration of level 1. At this point I was trying to get two completely different mine areas. So I showed one with stub tracks and one with through tracks. Although the client decided that he did not like this arrangement with the through tracks. He wanted something similar to the Perry mine. Also at Darton, on the satellite photograph, I found a side track with what looked like the remains of a truck dump. So I included that as well. Although the client asked me to delete it and replace it with a mine supply store instead. So I did that. And at this point I realized that I'd been misreading the map and the town is not Perry, it's Penny. So I've kept the mine the same name, but the junction I've just called Penny Junction instead. And we decided that we want to have a water tower at the junction so that locomotives can top off their tanks before assaulting the long upgrade back towards Shelby. And now the intermediate scenic area contains a town. When I followed this route closely on Google Maps, I realized that it crosses Shelby Creek several times. So I got 2 of those crossings in. It also passes through a few towns, including the town of Douglas. There's also numerous grade crossings, one of which is Collins Highway. So although this doesn't represent any particular location, it's a conglomeration of several points on that branch line. At this point, I still have the wide helix because originally I was trying to keep as much of the branch line visible at Shelby as possible. But once the main line above it had been rerouted, I was having to disappear from view further back, and this routing no longer made sense. So by going with 2 short helix laps instead of 1 long one, we can now save a lot of space and improve the scene. Here I continued developing the Darton mine. At first I was trying to get the spurs facing the other way, just to contrast from Perry, but the client decided he liked the conventional arrangement better. Also the Douglas scene has now been renamed Collins, because at the town of Collins, Buckfield Road passes under the railroad, sharing the same trestle as Shelby Creek, and that's always a very interesting arrangement on a model, so I've included it here. Another thing the client suggested was a flag stop depot at the grade crossing, so that's been included. So with this area now satisfactory, let's move on to another area. Now the logging area, which is level 3 in the media room, was the last area to be developed. At this point the client sent me a prototype sketch of the track arrangement from the 1950s at a place called Cass. And although that exact arrangement would not have worked in this site, I was able to get all the same elements in, just in a slightly different order. In this version, the only thing missing is the depot and the depot spur, which I eventually added on later versions of the plan. We can see the double track from Paintsville ending at this point. Although it may look like the double track continues, the second track here is actually the run round for the logging line and the interchange track. And we've kept the long siding before the helix, which of course is a long single track section. So it's one more location to stop a train and wait for its turn in the single track. So now the whole railroad has been developed to this stage. It's time to start going round, filling in scenic details, crossing the T's and dotting the I's. Here is level 1 in all its glory. And I think for this video, I'm going to try and experiment with a different presentation. Rather than going through the plan describing everything that I've done, I'm just going to follow the mainline route and let you decide for yourself what's important. As we can see, we have the south reversing loop, which will allow us to turn trains between sessions. And as I've already mentioned, south staging is of course the Clinchfield Railroad staging yard. And this whole level 1 scenic section is a fairly close, albeit very much condensed version of the prototype. I don't know whether the names that I've given the various places are correct. I've just taken nearby names from Google Maps and applied them to the railroad features that we need. And at the end of this scene, there is the continuous cutoff that I mentioned earlier. This allows the client to build just this portion of the railroad and be able to run his trains through a scenic setting, just to give him a sense of accomplishment so that he doesn't feel obligated to push on to the next phase before he's ready for it. It's always a good idea to try to find a way of getting something running fairly early on in these large projects. But ignoring that cutoff, we climb the helix up to Elkhorn, which is the start of level 2. Here, as I've already mentioned, the track arrangement is as close as we were able to get it to what we believe was there in the 1950s. On the other hand, Marrowbone is basically just a figment of my imagination. I did not find any information on the area other than the client told me there was a mine there. So here it is. The passing siding is rather short. It's the shortest one on the railroad, but it's still long enough for a local coal turn to be able to switch the mine and run around its train. And since it's very close to Elkhorn, the dispatcher doesn't really need to use this area for meets. Then we have the time-wasting loop up to Millard and Sutton, which run together just as they do in reality. They're very close together. The first half of Sutton is fairly close to what I believe the track arrangement could have been like. At the moment, there's only 3 tracks, but there is a gap between them where it looks as though a 4th track might have been lifted at this point. Beyond that, I've had to condense it greatly. These spurs should head the other way, and there should be another double-ended track further north, but there was just no room for it on the model. Head through the bathroom, and I've already described Shelby in quite a lot of detail. We can either take the branch back down to one of the mines on level 1, or we can climb a single lap of the main helix before reappearing in Shelbyana. Here there's a control point with a pair of crossovers, and although I'm not sure if the prototype operates that way, we are going to treat this as a true double track with right-hand running in both directions. That has the advantage that all the uphill trains will use the outer track of the helix, which of course has a slightly lesser grade, while the downhill trains use the slightly steeper grade on the inside. Anyway, we then climb the main helix, which is quite a long way. Halfway up it, we go from double to single. It's a bit unfortunate that that has to be a hidden junction, so this is probably a good location for a camera with closed circuit TV. And on the prototype, the double track does end halfway to the next town anyway. But for now, we completely skip level 3. We jump up to level 4. We emerge at John Allen Bridge. I have the double passing sidings that I mentioned earlier. And since the client asked for John Allen Bridge, I figure there's no harm done in suggesting other scenic treatments and place names from this famous railroad. Of course, we're basically climbing a ridge here which does not exist on the prototype. So that might be a good enough reason to change the scenery to look a little different. As we start to drop again, we have the option for some deep scenery at this point. Unfortunately, being a single lap helix, we can't have a tall trestle or anything else here because there's no way of hiding the track below it. Although I did suggest that we copy another John Allen-ism and call the area drains and have a tall retaining wall with a culvert through it. So we emerge from this 1.5 helix, back on level 3. We wind down the side of the mountain, coming out at Broad Bottom, where there is a large mine. And as on the prototype, it's served with double-ended tracks. We have another time-wasting loop, dropping down to Stratton Mine, which is another location on the prototype with a large mine. Earlier, the client had requested removal of this branch line. He didn't want the hidden staging tracks in this corner, so we've now kept just enough of it to serve as a switching lead for this mine. And although much of the switching can be done from the Paintsville end, the arriving train will need to be able to push the empties in from this end. Now, in contrast with the double track leaving Shelby, here it's not right-hand running, it's a primary main and a secondary main with both tracks used in both directions. The track nearest the aisle for the through trains and the rear track for local trains that are doing switching on this portion of the layout. Now, by this point in the development, the client had requested that we rename Van Leer to Prestonburg because it's a larger town, and he asked for the industrial spurs to serve an oil driller and a freight house. Here there's an opportunity for some urban modelling, and the look we're going for here is basically like small town USA. So a good opportunity for the Walthers Merchant Road kits and the various offerings from DPM. And although it's visually one area, depending on which side you view it from, it represents either Prestonburg or Paintsville. And then where the backdrop comes to an end, I've suggested a tall building. And although it's not going to be a skyscraper, something that's maybe 5 or 6 stories high with perhaps a water tank on the roof should be plenty high enough to disguise the end of the backdrop. And unlike on the lower levels where I have spread the backdrop to provide stability for supporting the upper decks, Here there's nothing above it, so we can just have a thin backdrop down the middle. And as I mentioned earlier, we've now got a dummy Y because the client didn't feel the need to turn locomotives here, and he wants to simplify the benchwork in this area, rather than having the main line have to climb over the top of it. And I may have mentioned earlier, he asked me to simplify this area and include just a coaling tower, team track, and car shops, which apparently is what was there during the 50s. Beyond Paintsville, the only changes in the track were to shorten the spurs at the sawmill to allow a little bit of space before the warehouse, and to shorten the pulpwood spur by about a car length, just to move it further from the stream crossing. And now we come back into the main helix again, but this time on the outer track. Beforehand we were using the inner track, and that comes out at the top. There is the cutoff to allow us to make a continuous circuit repeating levels 3 and 4, which would be an option that he might only ever use for open houses and things like that. But the main line heads straight into north staging, where there is room for 9 tracks at 2.5-inch spacing. One other thing I've shown here is how this top lap of the helix could be modified during construction to allow a shortcut directly from Shelby to north staging, allowing a proper loop-to-loop main line with just levels 1 and 2 before he builds any of levels 3 and 4. So once again, we have the design divided into easier steps. Anyway, that just about describes this layout. The client is very, very happy with it. I managed to get a lot more into his room than he thought I ever could. Before signing off, I have a few more diagrams to show you. As I mentioned, the track elevations and grade profile was revised slightly. One of the changes we made was to drop the helix lap spacing from 4 inches to 3 3/4, which means that we stay below a 2% ruling grade, bearing in mind that there are a few places where uphill trains do have to climb a 30-inch radius helix. And in the area between Pool Point and Clinchfield, we can either add in 1 additional helix lap and have this section of run virtually level, or we can eliminate 1 lap of the helix and start the climb at this tunnel at the expense of having a less than optimum spacing between decks at this point. I'm just going to run through the other plans quickly. Feel free to pause it if you want to study the grade profile. But basically, we are slightly below a 2% ruling grade on the main line, although the logging line does need 3% grades to get up and over the top of the main at this point. And other than the helixes, the only mainline grade that's as steep as 2% is the climb up from Broad Bottom to Summit. There's the 4th level. So now let's just go through the levels again. Here is a clean version of level 1 without any of the labels. Feel free to pause it if you want to. There's level 2. Level 3. And level 4. I'm not going to go deeply into the structural considerations that I discussed with the client. That would be beyond the scope of this video. So I'm just going to sign off here. I hope you enjoyed this video presentation, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.